The reason that I really wanted to talk to my coworkers who are not here at this presentation was because LightWave 11 introduces a new render engine. And this is a pretty big change. The last time they changed the render engine was in 9.2, when they introduced a better way to do adaptive sampling, when they introduced all kinds of good stuff. So what they did with LightWave 11 was they introduced a new render engine, a new way of doing things, and they called it unified sampling. So the reason they call it unified is that before, if you wanted to increase the samples for the lights, the samples for your shading, like reflection blur, refraction blur, you had to go over to the surface panel and bump up your samples from 8 to 16 or knock it down from 8 to 1. If you wanted to bump up your light qualities, which would default to 4, you would have to go to your area light, or you would have to go to your dome light or whatever, and you'd have to bump it up individually on all those lights. Well, what they did, and the lights would always be a scene property, but the shading quality was always a object property. It was always stored with the object, always stored with the surface file. So, what they changed in LightWave 11 is that all of those options are now gone. They've been consolidated, unified into 2 settings, just 2 settings, light samples and shading samples on the render panel. And it's now a scene property for not just lights, it's now a scene property for the surfacing too. It's like you can now up-res or down-res your shading samples on a per scene basis. You couldn't do that before. Before you'd have to create shot-specific objects if you wanted to do that. Oh, do we have... Dave, you rock. Let's see if I can get this done again. So, even though LightWave 11 offers some really amazing stuff, really freaking fun toys, on a practical level, for my coworkers who are not here today, it is so important that they understand what's changed in the freaking render engine, because it doesn't matter how much fun you're having with instancing or flocking or fracture or bullet or all the other great stuff that they added in there. If you don't know how to render your shot, you're hosed.
Right.
So that's why all my tests this morning, it was on unified sampling, because I wanted to give you guys a great presentation, and I did so many test renders I totally forgot to look at the time, and that's why we're starting this about 2:45. Okay, I have here the supreme awesomeness of test content. Actually, before I get into this, perhaps I should show. I want to make clear a couple things about how unified sampling works. There are some nice things that they did. Let's see. So when you open up the render globals, one of the nice things that they did is that your camera settings, your light settings, your radiosity, all of it is going to be on one panel. So you're not going to be hunting and pecking around your interface to get to what you need to get to set everything up for rendering. So that's a very good thing that they did. Okay, so what I have here is I've got just some regular shaded objects, and in a really horrific dome light situation where I've got really filthy dome light going on there. Because what I did was I set my light samples to 1. That's as filthy as it gets. I should probably explain what happens when the camera fires out its rays. When you okay. How many people are familiar with the render engine from 9.2 and up? Okay. I just wanted to see how much I needed to catch up everyone up here. They changed the anti-aliasing setting to minimum samples. What that refers to is when the camera fires out its rays for the entire shot, for the entire frame. For each pixel, in this case, because I have samples set to 1, it will fire off one sample, one camera sample. Once it hits that spot that the pixel represents, that's where this kicks in the render tab. That's for each ray that lands on that pixel, this is how many samples it will pick up, acquire from that pixel. And this is how many light samples, this is how many shading samples. I would like to point out that this does not affect radiosity. This light sample it's only going to be for area lights, dome lights, any light that has a blurred, a soft shadow that's not shadow mapped like a shadow mapped spotlight. Any ray traced soft shadowed light is going to be affected by light samples. It will not affect radiosity scenes. Huh? Or, sorry, oh, okay, no, I want to answer questions as I go. Like I said, this was intended to be a presentation for my coworkers who aren't here.
Does it affect things like subsurface scattering?
That's shading samples, because that's a surface property. It's a ray trace blurred surface property, so that would be under shading samples. So you can make the initial pass of the camera cleaner on a lighting level. What I have here is everything is lit up with just one dome light. See, set dome light, and it's a really broad-based dome light. So if I were to turn off adaptive sampling, okay, so minimum sample's 1, and you go to the render tab, and the light samples are set to 1. Shading samples does not apply because there's no reflection blur, no refraction blur, there's no subsurface scattering or anything soft happening in the shading. This is all lighting. So that's what happens when you have, and oh yeah, did I mention these are white objects and white lights hitting it? So this is what happens when you fire off one sample per pixel, and for each sample you're getting one light sample, one shading sample. Let's bump that number of light samples up to 8. And you see it got cleaner. As a demonstration, I don't recommend you do this unless you really, really have to. So that's light sample set to 32. And the shading's getting really clean, but notice that what you can see of the edges are still aliased here. Let me bump up the multiplier. The reason I want to point out that bumping up the shading quality or the lighting quality will not give you any kind of necessarily an anti-aliased edge quality. I want to emphasize that. This is only affecting the quality of the lights. And the reason that's really important to know is because there is a way in LightWave to get a little bit of a free lunch. I don't know if you can tell, but that's not really... It'd probably be if I made the ground plane not render so that you could see the alpha, because the alpha would totally tell you the tail of the geometry, and the geometry is anti-aliasing. So they're anti-aliasing. If you want geometry anti-aliasing, you bump up the camera anti-aliasing, the camera samples. The camera the camera in turn collects light samples. So yes, you're increasing the amount of light quality per ray there, but you're not getting any kind of anti-aliasing benefit on these edges. But if I were to go over here and set the light samples to 8, actually I'm just going to set it to fixed for now, and I'll tell you why in a bit. If I were to set that to 32, or actually wait, let's reverse it completely. Set that to 1 before the camera was set to 1 sample of quality, and the light was set to 32 samples. Let's try it the other way around.
while.
Increasing the camera samples has a bigger effect on it then than increasing the light samples.
Increasing the camera samples will anti-alias the geometry.
So it's going to take render longer.
Well,
What's your maximum samples?
256.
It's going to take a while.
Actually, I'm trying to remember if I had adaptive sampling on set for the last one. I didn't? Okay, let me turn it off. Sorry, guys. Let's go to camera. Turn that off for now. So now it's just a straight comparison.
Does this new render your backward compatibility with older scenes?
If you load your older scene into LightWave 11, no, it defaults, because this is a new system, so what it does is it defaults the light quality and the shading quality to 8, and the camera samples will default to 1 with and the maximum will also be set to 1. That's something new in LightWave 11 is they introduced a cutoff. So if the maximum is set to 1, then after it takes its 1 sample, it will stop and take no more samples. Okay, so this is reversed. Light quality of 1, but camera quality of 32. That was before, after. Now notice that the shading is very similar on both, but you're getting an anti-aliasing benefit from the camera. So that was when the camera was set to 1 sample, so it wasn't really collecting information on the geometry. It's more noticeable in the alpha. That's with camera sample set to 1, that's with it set to 32. But did you notice that even though I had the light quality set to 1, it still came out a little bit cleaner than if I had the camera sample, than before when I had, that was light quality set to 1, camera samples set to 1. And if you're only firing off 1 ray per pixel, you're going to get a fair bit of noise there. But if you're firing off 32 rays per pixel, then you're going to get 32 samples of light per pixel. Does that make sense? So technically, you should be setting your light quality very low and have the light quality just hitch a ride on the camera for overall quality, so that you'd bump up your camera samples and just let that gather all. Technically, you should be doing that. I ran into 1 or 2 situations where you have to bump both of them up. And I'd like to show you that right now. So I'm going to set I'm just killing that for now because I'm going to set okay. How many people are familiar with these sampling patterns? Well, this used to be called blue noise.
Was it?
A low discrepancy. Low discrepancy used to be called blue noise in the older system. And the big classic, this really only matters if it's firing off more than 1 ray per pixel, although I guess when you're gathering multiple rays on each adaptive sampling pass, I guess you are firing off more than 1 ray per pixel, right, Dave?
The classic sampling pattern is actually a sphere, or a disk.
It's radial. But since you're firing off 1 ray at a time with the adaptive sampling passes on LightWave 11, I guess it just fires off radially for each new one. That's probably what it's doing. Just to make sense of what I said just there, another change between the old render engine and the new one is that with the old render engine, with the adaptive sampling passes, you saw when I turned on adaptive sampling how it went white.
Yeah, to the whole object rather than the edges.
Well, what it's doing is, it would do just the edges if I start out really clean to begin with. So let's do that. And while it's doing this, I'm going to set this to 100%. Set that to 32 so it starts out clean. Hit F9. Okay, in the old system, what would happen was every time it detected a high contrast point, anytime 2 neighboring pixels exceeded the contrast threshold set right here with threshold, and maybe it would help if I actually turned on adaptive sampling. Anytime neighboring pixels exceeded the threshold in terms of their contrast, it would send it right back to get re-rendered. In the F9 preview, it would go white. Those neighboring pixels would be highlighted as white, and they'd get re-rendered. What the old engine would do is it would double the amount of rays. So if I started out with 32, it would fire off 64 rays on the second pass, and then 128 on the next pass, and then it would just keep increasing exponentially. But with this one, it's only firing off one additional ray per render pass, instead of doubling it up. So with the older system, there was a chance that on the last pass, where it's doubled it to the nth degree, there's a chance it could overshoot your quality target. With the new one, it only rises to meet the quality target. There's no chance of overshoot anywhere. So while 0.03 might have been fine for LightWave 9.2, because a lot of areas might have overshot into 0.02 or 0.01 territory for quality, on this one, 0.03, all of them will just rise to meet the 0.03 quality, and you might have to lower it to 0.02 or 0.01 if you want to get a similar quality to what you had before.
Yet I notice you're using 0, so.
What? No, I'm not. I'm using 0.01. Oh, you were looking at oversampling. I mean, you could put 0 in there, and I guess now's a good time to tell you what the maximum samples does for you. What it does now, before we had no cutoff. It would just keep going until the threshold was met, regardless of how futile the process was. If you had a super high contrast thing that would never, ever, ever get anti-aliased, well, it would just keep slogging away. Now there's a cutoff point where you can tell LightWave to push back from the table and just call it a day.
There's always been a cutoff, but you just weren't sure what it was, you had to figure it out yourself.
True.
It's like with samples of 3, if you set the threshold to 0.03, you would get 4 adaptive sampling passes, which maxes out at 96 samples. Because the way it doubled everything.
Well, at this one, it's the way it works is if the pixel has either met the threshold or if it's already fired off 256 rays at that sucker and it's not getting any cleaner, if one of those two conditions are met, that's it. That thing's not getting rendered anymore. So, yes, the lower this value, the faster stuff will render. But if you have something that requires a lot of cleanup, you might want to give it a bit of breathing room on the maximum samples. For example, exaggerated motion blur, really filthy lighting, filthy shading. Maybe you do want it to increase that maximum samples to give it some breathing room. I'd also like to emphasize that, again, lighting samples only matter if your light casts a soft ray trace shadow. If it does not cast a soft ray trace shadow, if we're talking about distant light, just a regular distant light, which has a hard ray trace shadow, hit F9, and it doesn't matter what your lighting samples were set to, that's your baseline. That's what adaptive sampling will be starting with, is something freaking clean. So, okay, so unified sampling, step 1, light samples. You're if the fewer of them that it has to collect, the faster your render will go. But if you have put it into a difficult situation, for example, if you have a dome light, like a really soft 90-degree dome light, you might want to consider bumping up the shading samples then to 4 or 8, just to give it a better baseline for its shading if you're using low discrepancy. If you have to use the least amount of samples, consider going to fixed or classic for your sampling pattern, just so you avoid the edge artifacting we ran into earlier. Any questions on lighting?
What was the old light quality set to? How was that the rate?
Oh yes, very good point. In the old system, an area light quality of 4, the 4 actually meant a 4x4 grid. It would actually have been 4 squared. So the equivalent of an area light quality of 4 in the old system would be a light quality light sample set to 16. So I've got dome light set back to 90. So if I were to feed 16 into here, if you want, for shading samples, no. Actually, 8 in the old system, 8 meant 8. So I guess I could move on to looking into the shading. Oh, actually, wait. I wanted to emphasize another thing. Light samples has nothing whatsoever to do with radiosity. I want to emphasize that. So when the camera fires out its rays, it's gathering lighting samples, area lights, dome lights, not distant lights because those don't have fuzzy ray trace shadows. It's gathering shading samples for all your blurred reflections and stuff like that. But it's also gathering radiosity samples, and that's a separate setting. It's still separate from just as it was in the old system where area lights was a separate deal from radiosity quality. And
Where is that 11 now, the global illumination panel?
exact same tab that you'll find the camera panel on. They unified where the sampling was located. They also unified the tabs. So if you go to the left, there's your global illumination. And I did set up a scene. Backdrop radiosity. Where I set the RPE to this is like non-interpolated radiosity. So let's see how. So you saw my baseline was fairly clean because I was. Now this is only lit with radiosity. I had turned off the one light in the scene, and you saw how like the initial thing, it wasn't filthy. It was fairly clean. 10 samples of radiosity. So I'm just wondering how long it might take to render on Dave's machine.
So if you turn the light off, what is illuminating then?
Oh, what I did was I added a textured environment.
Oh, okay.
And on the pitch, and also all this content that I'm showing you guys, I'm going to give it to Ken so he can upload it to the users group website. So you can totally run these tests using this completely awesome content as a starting point.
Once we get 11.
Well, there is a 30-day trial on the New Tech website. So there it is, gathering.
Jen, a question. Are you finding users are getting a lot of differences between 10's rendering and 11's rendering? I mean, are people loading up 10?
Based on the one sample that lives with me, I'll take the 5th. Well, here's the thing. All right, I'm just going to give like a side story of that. I went to another forum, and this one kid posted on there that he was surprised that New Tech hadn't mentioned the faster render times that people were getting because he had loaded up older scenes of his, and he was getting a 50% speed up. I read this out loud, and then I turned around to Dave and I said, I told you no one optimizes their scenes. Because that's why I figured the kid probably left everything at, especially if he left his area lights at a quality of 4, which is 16 samples, and in LightWave 11, it defaults to 8 samples. I mean, yes, you're going to, the difference would probably be negligible because like, you still have the camera cleaning up everything that it can. The difference between 8 and 16 visually won't be that much, but it's still less work. It's half the work for the render engine to do. There are that would be a value of like, yeah, from 9 to 16 samples in the old system. Yeah, 3 to 4. So let's see. So there we go. Oh, that's another nice thing about LightWave 11. See what it's giving you up here? It gives you your render times. And it remembers it for all of them. See all that? 11 seconds, 2 minutes.
And if you click on the metadata, it tells you the camera settings for each of your renders too, so you can do your experiments and go back and look and see what your camera settings will be for different renders.
It's good for experimenting that way, so you don't forget which render was done with which camera setting.
Save that with the file if you save the file.
The JPEGs it will.
Really? Okay. You said you're using the texture environment, what is it, just gradient?
Oh yeah, this is all it is. Go in here,
Yeah.
go to texture,
Okay.
set parameter pitch, and it means white at the top, fading down to black at the bottom of the sphere. And that's it. Ambient occlusion, and now we get into shading. So I've got adaptive sampling turned off. And I've got these objects that are all set to ambient occlusion. The one light in the scene is turned off. There is no radiosity. These objects are just entirely lit with ambient occlusion, and that's it. That's what I meant to show you. So that's with the shading samples now set to 8. This is with them set to 1. You can see where this is going. Okay, so if I set the camera samples to 8, so that for each ray fired off of the camera, I get, whoops. So that's with shading set to 8, but camera set to 1, and that's with it reversed. Now, the shading quality is similar. There can be a benefit to increasing the base camera setting. I just have it left on at 8 because I forgot to set back to 1. But there was one situation I ran into where both the shading and the camera baseline had to be set to a value higher than 1 in order to eliminate a problem in a corner. And that's in here, not in this scene. But I'll be getting to that in a bit.
No, I'm just curious, I mean, why not just leave it at a higher setting to begin with? Is it a real rendering hit?
Well, here's an example. Let's say you had a really heavy spaceship against the emptiness of black. And you wasted like 64 samples on this huge area of black.
Oh, yeah.
That's where you probably want to start with a baseline of 1. But if the whole thing's a mess from the get-go, like if you're looking down at a forest, then you probably want to start with a higher baseline. There was one shot. This was, well, in 10.1. Actually, there was a 9.6 shot that, as Anthony is my witness, when I was working over at Motion Theory, there was these bushes that, it was just like a crazy thing where these bushes were, they're way off in the distance, and one pixel could represent 22 high contrast shaded leaves. And when you rendered it with adaptive sampling, like set it to a low baseline, and then this was 9.6, you rendered it, and to your face it would look perfectly fine. But then you looked at the sequence because the camera was moving down a road, and there was noise. It looked like film grain. And the way to get rid of it in the end was I kept trying all different stuff, and then finally what made it go away was that I bumped up the base samples to 312 or something like that, and I turned off adaptive sampling completely because at that point it's not doing anything. But then it had enough, that was what finally made it all go away, because then it was able to fire off enough rays to correctly determine what that pixel should be for each frame, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
So that was in 9.6, but that was like a crazy situation. Dave doesn't do bushes. You didn't do that one though. Okay, so that was low discrepancy using shading samples of 4 instead of 1. Cleaner baseline, better shading on those edges.
What's the render time difference?
Oh, let's see,
Just a couple seconds.
49, 41. Because it had to gather more information per pixel. So that's a introduction to shading samples. This was ambient occlusion, which is a surface property, a shading property. That's why shading samples affect it. let me turn off the anti-aliasing completely so that we can take a look at what the baseline was. That was the baseline. That was 4 samples per, oh, wait, maybe I should turn this off too. Okay, that was the baseline. Okay, that's 4 samples. And all the lights are disabled in the scene, so they're not contributing anything.
On the shading samples, how is that a direct interpretation from the old LightWave as far as, say, node settings when you have samples per off the surface?
But with the old system for shading samples of 1 through 3, apparently that was the same as hard coding it to 4 because of a bug. That's what I heard, was that you'd set it to 1 and in reality it would be using 4.
I think that was for like the surface panel where it just had a percentage.
Oh, I see.
Maybe.
Because there's a definite time difference with all the other values in the nodes.
So I want to emphasize that ambient occlusion, if you want cleaner ambient occlusion, you're going to have to bump up the number of shading, bumping up the number of shading samples is one way to do it. But if you have a clean enough baseline, you can just let the regular adaptive sampling clean it up. If you have a clean enough baseline, or if you're using fixed or classic. If you're using fixed or classic, you can set it to 1 and let adaptive sampling deal with it. Whoops. It helps if you turn on adaptive sampling. So I just set, again, filthy level of 1. Looks like something you'd find in a newspaper. Maybe now is a good time to emphasize that if you want to cut off after a certain point, lower your maximum sample setting. Right there. I've effectively given it permission to fire off up to 256 rays per pixel, and it looks like it's taking me at its word. So I've got zoomed in. And that's ambient occlusion under the new system. So there was one more situation. Any question about the use of maximum samples, sampling patterns, threshold, lighting samples versus shading samples so far? The relevant section in the manual, I'm not kidding, is about 6 pages. It's very short because they really did simplify the whole system by reducing the number of controls available to you.
What's changed in the lighting panel?
Well, if you have a dome light, you notice that there's no quality underneath the angle. That's the big one. Because that's been moved over here.
Even under Dennis's lights? Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'd have to check to see if third-party systems are marching to their own drummer. They probably are. Well, there you go. So that's that. This one I'm going to load next. Let's see how. I'm not going to render the whole thing. I'll give you an idea of what it looks like in VPR. Blurred reflections and dielectric glass spheres. So there was one situation that I found where you had to, in order to clean up one corner, and this is if you really, and like I said, okay, I'm chattering all over the place. One thing I keep bringing up is with the low discrepancy sampling pattern is if you feed it filth, really filthy stuff as a baseline, then it might have some difficulties cleaning that up on certain situations. I ran into that here. So I've got shading samples set to 1. And let's set the camera samples to 8. And I'm pretty sure, let me just render just this one little bit. And I'm pretty sure this part will be fine because I think I've got the culprit disabled. Yeah, this is perfectly fine. this is blurred reflection, and the thing that it's reflecting is a fairly, I've got dots, I've got a texture environment that uses the crust texture to have really bright luminescent dots. And see, no problem there. But earlier today, one of the things that I did, let's go to 4. Sorry, let's go to the perspective view, go into VPR, just see if I can show you what the texture environment looks like. See all this big, the crust texture? Big luminous spheres that look all cool and stuff when reflected and refracted through the geometry. And that's great, big old spotlights. Well, earlier today, I had another texture in there, and it was a texture that was 1/10 of that dot texture. See that? So that's a bit of a problem. Oh, limited region, forgot. So turning that on caused me a bit of a problem with the with that little corner. And what I think the problem was that I was giving it a really high contrast thing to reflect. And the blurred reflection, the original Filthy Pass was returning some really high contrast pixels. And for whatever reason, notice it's not getting clean, the large area is not getting cleaned up. That's not good. Even there you can kind of see it. So I found out that for that situation, if you have, I think that similar problems happened under the old system, because I remember on Terra Nova what they did with a lot of, for reflection, for images they wanted to reflect in reflective objects and surfaces, they'd create a blurred version of the black backdrop, map it to a sphere, have that sphere envelop the scene, have it unseen by radiosity, so it wouldn't interfere with the radiosity, but it would reflect in all the surfaces, because it would see that as a reflection before it would never escape and see the backdrop as the reflection. So high contrast images could wreak havoc in the old system too. So if you increase the shading quality, that alone's not enough to do it. See how this noise is still there? So what I found out was that you had to bump up like the camera quality too. Just get it over the hump. And then it was able to give you a clean result. So that was one situation I ran into where it wasn't enough to bump up the quality of the surface quality. I also have to bump up the initial camera quality too. I don't know how often you guys use really crazy high contrast textures for your reflections to like for your backdrops to reflect in your surfaces. But if you run into that situation, you're going to have to bump it up on both levels. It's possible that I overdid it. Maybe I didn't have to bump up the camera this high. Maybe I didn't have to bump up the shading this high, but I sure as heck couldn't leave them both at 1. So there it is at 400%. And oh look, no noise. That was noisy. That's not. I don't know how common that situation is going to be, but it's something to keep in mind. If you ever run into that, consider bumping up the camera in addition to the...
in samples of 3 and set the shading quality to 2 or 3. And drop the maximum samples down to 96.
So we're not waiting here forever?
Yeah. I should be pretty much in post when you have 96.
Hmm.
From there, just dial things up a little bit at a time. Find out when it starts cleaning up and then stick with that. So you don't want to start with a high number like 32 and then find out that, well, you could have done it with 8. yeah, that 32 is wasting a lot of samples then.
Still has some black dots in there. And still has some black dots in there. Of course, the easiest way to fix it is for me to just deactivate that offensive texture. 26 seems to be good for this situation. You're going to have to judge on a shot-by-shot basis. So that's 26, 32 camera samples minimum, and 26 samples minimum, but with 96 as the cutoff instead of 256. So it wasn't able to get fancier with some of the pixels. Any questions? It's a pretty dry subject, but it's so nuts and bolts that I really wish one of my coworkers showed up today.
Does the, quick question, does the unified sampling system, technique, whatever, help alleviate the global illumination filtering issues?
Different agent, yeah.
Okay.
From what I saw in Terra Nova, there were two approaches to that. One was to brute force it and have a low starting point of rays per evaluation. The other way was to use interpolated, but to fire off 100 or more rays per evaluation, 100 to 200 rays per evaluation, so that it had lots of breathing room. It wouldn't use all 100 to 200 rays at once, but it would have enough breathing room to gather enough information to not flicker, or at least not noticeably artifact. So those were the two approaches I saw in Terra Nova. So that's my really dry unified sampling presentation. Oh, you had another question?
One of the issues that Chad was having, unfortunately, he had to leave a little early, was with subsurface scattering from Japan. He has a character that he created and rendered, and it was approved as such in LightWave 10. We've since switched over to 11, and now he's having problems getting the same subsurface scattering look that he did. Would that be something he would need to address then in the shading samples? Because the node is different. Okay, because the node is different. I mean, the parameters in the node are different. So,
The parameters are different?
yeah. Well, there's no sampling input in the node.
Yeah, so he'd bump up the shading samples and...
The issue is, can he get that same look in 11?
I'd have to see it.
Yeah, I know.
Honest to gosh.
Well, the reflections have changed.
Yeah.
Because they're more accurate for reflections. The problem is if you want those nice wide reflections, well, they've taken that away from you. And for instance, that with that plane in the background, which has the old clear reflections, I can't get it match that. There's no way. And it's like, oh, I like that better.
Yeah, I just disabled. I just disabled one. Let's see if I can get it.
All the reflections have more of a linear look to them, which is actually more accurate. It looks nice.
See this?
I like that.
But
if you want to go the other way, where it's more of a matte reflection, you can't get it.
See how from a low angle, that is a big change. My gosh, I'm sorry guys, I forgot to tell you this. They changed the way reflections blur in LightWave 11. It's now more like what you'd actually see in real life as the sun sets over the ocean and things streak downwards visually as a vertical. That's the new default for LightWave 11. If you want LightWave 10 style reflections where it was just your reflection but blurred, you're going to have to use LightWave 10. There is no going back. There's no option for this.
There's no post effect that can be applied?
Yes, if the reflections, if you just output like an unblurred reflection and then blurred it in post, then wouldn't that match the LightWave 10 reflections, Dave?
Kinda, it'll always be different because it's a different way of blurring again. Because you're blurring an image that's already rendered and not something that's being calculated.
That's the problem with the wrong images.
Turn off draft mode. Just see if it gets nicer. But that's the big difference in LightWave 11 is that for blurred reflections, is they've made it more realistic.
It's nice.
It
actually looks like a wet surface.
Exactly. I'd like to see some car heads.
But if you want like a nice, just a matte aluminum finish, it's not always like that. It spreads out more.
Interesting.
You can't get that spread anymore.
Yep.